There's a moment in history when everything changes, not because of a battle or a treaty, but because of a single whispered promise, broken in the dark. Picture this, a dimly lit workshop filled with the scent of sulfur and crushed herbs, where an apprentice alchemist hesitates before betraying their master. It might seem like a small act, a personal betrayal, but what if I told you that such moments didn't just ruin relationships, they rewired the fate of kingdoms? This is the untold story of how broken oaths between alchemists became the hidden architects of medieval power. These weren't just disputes over recipes or stolen secrets. They were seismic shifts that toppled dynasties, redirected the flow of wealth, and even determined who sat on thrones. Alchemy in the medieval world was far more than the pursuit of turning lead into gold. It was a currency of trust, a network of knowledge so valuable that those who controlled it held the keys to empires. And when that trust was shattered, when an apprentice defied their oath, the consequences rippled far beyond the walls of their workshop. Imagine a world where a single vial of forbidden knowledge could destabilize a king's court, or where the loss of a secret formula could bankrupt an entire noble house. These weren't just theoretical dangers, they happened over and over in ways that history books often overlook. So why does this matter to us today? Because these stories reveal a truth about power that still resonates. The most explosive forces in history aren't always armies or laws. Sometimes they're the quiet betrayals, the unspoken alliances, the secrets traded in shadow. Over the next few minutes, we'll uncover how these broken oaths between alchemists didn't just change lives, they redrew the map of the medieval world. From the fall of powerful families to the rise of unexpected rulers, this is a tale of ambition, deception, and the fragile bonds that held society together. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover might just change how you see history and the hidden levers that still shape our world today. To understand why alchemy held such power in royal courts, we need to look beyond the bubbling flasks and cryptic symbols. Think of it like this: in a world where wealth was measured in gold and silver, any ruler who could produce more of it would rewrite the rules of power. That's why kings and queens kept alchemists close, not as mere scholars, but as strategic assets. The court of Emperor Rudolf II in Prague became a magnet for these seekers of hidden knowledge, a place where alchemy wasn't just tolerated but celebrated. His palace halls buzzed with whispered conversations about the philosopher's stone, a substance rumored to grant eternal life and limitless riches. But here's the catch: when an apprentice learned these secrets, they didn't just carry formulas, they held leverage over the most powerful people in the realm. Take the story of Edward Kelly, an alchemist whose reputation for turning base metals into gold earned him royal favor, until his ambitions outpaced his loyalty. When Kelly secretly promised his knowledge to rival courts, he didn't just betray his patron, he ignited diplomatic fires that burned for years. This wasn't unique to Prague. In England, France, and beyond, alchemists became pawns in high-stakes games of espionage. A disgruntled apprentice could sell their master's secrets to a rival kingdom, or worse, use them to manipulate their own sovereign. The line between scholar and spy blurred dangerously, and that's where the real danger lay. Alchemy wasn't just about chemistry, it was about trust. A king who poured his treasury into funding an alchemist's work wasn't just investing in science, he was betting his reign on a person. When that trust broke, the consequences were catastrophic. Failed experiments could be dismissed, but a betrayal that could topple a dynasty. Imagine a royal treasury drained by years of funding secret research, only for the promised gold to vanish along with the alchemist who swore it was possible. The economic shockwaves could spark rebellions, bankrupt noble houses, or even force kings to raise taxes on an already struggling population. This is why broken oaths between alchemists mattered far beyond the workshop. They weren't just personal betrayals, they were cracks in the foundation of power itself. Every time an apprentice turned against their master, they didn't just steal knowledge. They destabilized the delicate balance of trust that held medieval courts together, and in a world where alchemy could make or break kingdoms, that was a risk no ruler could afford to ignore. The moment an apprentice alchemist dipped their finger into ink or sometimes blood to sign their oath of secrecy, they weren't just agreeing to keep quiet. They were stepping into a world where knowledge was more tightly guarded than royal jewels. These vows weren't scribbled on parchment as mere formalities. They were sworn in candlelit ceremonies, often with hands placed over ancient texts or alchemical symbols, binding the apprentice to silence with the weight of divine retribution. To break such an oath wasn't just a personal failing. It was an act that could unravel the very fabric of trust that kept alchemy's power in check. Consider the rituals themselves. In some workshops, apprentices recited vows while holding a vial of mercury, a metal believed to carry the essence of transformation, as if to say, just as this substance changes, so too will your fate if you betray this trust. Other masters demanded their students swear on the emerald tablet, the legendary foundation of alchemical wisdom, linking their loyalty to the sacred roots of the craft. These ceremonies weren't empty theater. They were psychological anchors designed to make the cost of betrayal feel unthinkable. But here's the twist. The very intensity of these oaths reveals how fragile the system truly was. If secrecy could be taken for granted, why the need for such dramatic safeguards? The truth is, alchemy thrived in the gaps between loyalty and ambition. An apprentice might spend years grinding herbs, copying manuscripts, and tending furnaces, all while watching their master trade secrets for patronage, wealth, or protection. Sooner or later, the question would arise, if knowledge was power, why should it remain locked in one person's hands? That's why the stories of broken oaths often read like thrillers. Take the case of a 15th-century German apprentice who fled his master's workshop with a stolen formula, only to be hunted down by agents of a bishop who'd funded the research. The apprentice's fate, public branding not just as a thief, but as a traitor to the divine order itself, or the infamous breach in Venice, where an alchemist's former student sold his cipher to a rival city-state, sparking a clandestine war over control of a prized dye recipe. In both cases, the punishment wasn't just about the act, it was a message to anyone who might dare to follow. Yet for every apprentice who kept their oath, another calculated the risks and chose betrayal. Sometimes out of desperation, like those who traded secrets to escape debt or persecution. Other times, it was pure ambition, like the Spanish apprentice who used his master's notes to secure a position at a rival court, leaving behind a trail of encrypted threats. And then there were those who broke their vows without even realizing it, whispering a harmless-seeming detail to the wrong person, only to watch it spiral into a crisis. What made these betrayals so dangerous wasn't just the loss of knowledge. It was the way they poisoned the well of trust for everyone. After a high-profile breach, masters would clamp down harder, sharing less, slowing the very progress alchemy relied on. Patrons grew wary, demanding guarantees that couldn't truly be given. The entire ecosystem of innovation and patronage would freeze sometimes for generations. In this way, a single broken oath didn't just alter one life. It reshaped what was possible for alchemy itself. So when we read about these oaths today, we're not just looking at quaint historical curiosities. We're seeing the fault lines of a system built on secrets, and the moments when those secrets broke free, changing history in ways no one could predict. The story begins in the shadowed halls of a 12th century French duke's castle, where an alchemist named Bertrand toiled over a flask of crimson liquid, a formula rumored to stretch the lifespan of those who drank it. His patron, Duke Henry of Burgundy, had poured fortunes into its creation, banking on it to secure his legacy. But history remembers this moment not for the elixir's success, but for the night Bertrand's apprentice, a sharp-eyed young man named Luc, slipped the recipe into his sleeve and vanished into the fog. What seemed like a simple act of theft became a seismic event. Within months, the Duke's health began to falter, not from natural causes, but because Luc had sold the formula to a rival lord, who ensured the Duke's supply was quietly replaced with a harmless tonic. This wasn't just a stolen secret, it was a political weapon. The rival, Count Thibault, used the elixir to buy allegiance from the Duke's own knights, promising them the same longevity their lord had coveted. As the Duke weakened, so did his grip on power. Taxes went uncollected, borders went undefended, and by the time his heir took the throne, the dynasty's coffers were drained from futile attempts to recreate the lost formula. The lesson was clear. In medieval Europe, alchemy wasn't just about science, it was about control. A single apprentice's betrayal had done what armies couldn't. It dismantled a ruling family from within. The fallout didn't stop there. Luc's theft sent shockwaves through the alchemical community. Masters began encrypting their recipes in ciphers so complex they took decades to crack. Patrons demanded blood oaths from apprentices, and workshops became fortresses of paranoia, but the damage was done. The case of the vanishing elixir proved something dangerous. Secrets could be weaponized. From that moment on, every ruler knew alchemy wasn't just a tool for immortality or wealth. In the wrong hands, it was the ultimate silent assassin, capable of toppling dynasties without a single sword drawn. And perhaps most chilling of all, Luc was never caught. Some say he faded into obscurity, living out his days under a new name. Others claim he became a shadowy figure, selling his stolen knowledge to the highest bidder. But his true legacy wasn't personal gain, it was the precedent he set. After his betrayal, no alchemist could assume their work was safe, and no ruler could ignore the fact that the greatest threats to their power might not come from battlefields, but from the whispered promises of a disgruntled apprentice. There's a reason medieval rulers feared counterfeit gold more than invading armies, because money wasn't just currency, it was the lifeblood of their authority. And nowhere was that more apparent than in 15th century Burgundy, where a single altered formula turned the alchemist's workshop into a battleground for economic survival. The master alchemist, Guy de Clermont, had spent years refining a process to purify gold, or so his patron, Duke Charles the Bold, believed. What no one knew was that Guy's apprentice, a quiet young man named Philippe, had been tinkering with the recipe in secret. Not to improve it, but to mimic it. By adding traces of copper to the final mixture, he created a convincing fake, a gold-like alloy that could pass casual inspection but would never hold its value. At first, the scheme seemed brilliant. Philippe siphoned off small amounts of the counterfeit, selling it to merchants who never suspected the deception. But greed has a way of outpacing caution. Within months, the volume of gold flooding Burgundy's markets became impossible to ignore. Prices spiraled as traders lost faith in the coinage. The Duke's own taxes were paid in this tainted metal, leaving his treasury bloated with worthless currency. By the time the forgery was uncovered, the damage was irreversible. Loans couldn't be repaid, soldiers couldn't be paid, and when Charles's rivals in Flanders caught wind of the crisis, they pounced, refusing to accept Burgundian coin at all. This wasn't just financial chaos, it was a calculated unraveling of power. Philippe's forgery didn't just enrich him, it exposed the fragility of an entire system. Medieval economies relied on trust far more than modern ones. There were no central banks or standardized assays. A ruler's wealth was quite literally their word stamped onto metal. When that trust eroded, so did their ability to govern. Charles's allies began demanding payment in kind, grain, land, anything but his now suspect gold. The Duke's influence crumbled so completely that within 2 years, the House of Valois-Burgundy, once a dynasty to rival kings, was forced into humiliating treaties just to keep their lands intact. What makes Philippe's betrayal so chilling isn't just the scale of the damage, it's how ordinary it began. No grand conspiracy, no shadowy cabal, just one resentful apprentice tweaking a formula in the dead of night. Yet that small act became a masterclass in how alchemy could be weaponized, because while armies conquer territory, counterfeiters conquer trust, and in a world where money and power were inseparable, that made alchemists the ultimate insurgents. Long after Philippe disappeared, likely into the employ of one of Charles's rivals, his legacy lived on. Future dukes would keep their alchemists under armed guard, not just to protect secrets, but to protect the very foundation of their rule. Because now they knew the right formula in the wrong hands could bring a kingdom to its knees. The choice between loyalty and survival was never straightforward for an alchemist's apprentice. Imagine spending years in dim workshops, grinding minerals until your hands cracked, memorizing symbols that felt like fragments of divine language, only to watch your master's patron die suddenly, leaving you with nothing but forbidden knowledge and empty pockets. This wasn't just a moral quandary, it was a matter of bread and shelter. In a world where apprentices relied entirely on their master's connections, the death of a wealthy sponsor could mean instant destitution. That's why some of history's most infamous betrayals weren't acts of greed, they were acts of desperation. Take the case of Mathias, a Hungarian apprentice in the 1400s. When his master's patron, a powerful baron, was executed in a political purge, Mathias was left with two options: honor his oath and face starvation, or sell the baron's alchemical secrets to the very faction that had overthrown him. He chose survival. Within weeks, Mathias was dining at the new regent's table, while the baron's family, who'd once funded the research, sank into poverty. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across Europe, apprentices became collateral damage in the volatile world of court politics. A change in regime, a shift in alliances, even a noble's sudden interest in newer, more fashionable sciences, any of these could render years of sworn loyalty meaningless. But here's what rulers failed to grasp: desperation wasn't the only motive. Some apprentices broke oaths not because they had to, but because they saw first and how fragile the system was. After years of watching masters hoard knowledge, sell half-truths to patrons, or take credit for an apprentice's discoveries, the moral weight of those ceremonial vows began to fray. Why should an apprentice starve for secrets their master had likely stolen from someone else? That's the uncomfortable truth behind many betrayals. They weren't just about survival. They were about fairness, and dynasties paid dearly for ignoring this tension. When the Medici family lost their court alchemist's apprentice to a rival city, they didn't just lose a set of formulas. They lost the trust of every other alchemist in their employ. Suddenly, every workshop became a potential liability, every experiment a risk. The more tightly rulers tried to control their alchemists, locking away manuscripts, demanding stricter oaths, the more they fueled the resentment that led to breaches. It became a vicious cycle. Each betrayal justified harsher measures, which in turn made future betrayals more likely. What's haunting is how many of these apprentices vanished from history after their acts of defiance. Some, like Mathias, enjoyed brief favor before being discarded once their knowledge was extracted. Others fled to monasteries, changed their names, or died in obscurity. But their legacy wasn't personal, it was systemic. Every broken oath taught rulers a brutal lesson. You couldn't build an empire on secrets without expecting those secrets to slip through your fingers. And in the end, the alchemist's dilemma wasn't just about loyalty versus survival. It was about how power, when hoarded too tightly, always finds a way to escape. Sometimes the most explosive revelations begin with something as small as a misplaced ledger. In the winter of 1372, an apprentice alchemist named Florian was tidying his master's workshop in the Duchy of Lorraine when he uncovered a stack of letters hidden beneath a floorboard, letters addressed to the court of England's Edward III. At first glance, it might have seemed innocuous. Alchemists corresponded across borders all the time, sharing fragments of knowledge, but these weren't scholarly notes. They were detailed reports on the Duke's military fortifications, disguised as alchemical recipes. Florian's master, Arnauld, wasn't just studying metals. He was selling secrets to a kingdom preparing for war. What happened next wasn't just a betrayal, it was a detonation. Florian, torn between loyalty and the sheer scale of the treason, took the letters to the Duke's spymaster. Within days, Arnauld was dragged from his workshop in chains, but the fallout didn't stop there. The letters revealed something far larger, a web of alchemists across Europe who'd been quietly funneling political intelligence under the guise of exchanging scientific knowledge. These weren't isolated incidents, they were proof that alchemy had become the perfect cover for espionage, its cryptic language serving as a cipher for state secrets. And here's where it gets even darker. When Edward III learned his intelligence network had been exposed, he didn't back down. He accelerated his plans, launching raids on French-held territories months earlier than intended. Why? Because the alchemical pipeline wasn't just about information, it was about resources. The same workshops producing counterfeit gold for one kingdom were often stockpiling saltpeter for another. Control the alchemists and you controlled the ingredients of war. The conflict that followed, later dubbed the Alchemists' War, lasted 3 bloody years. Borders shifted, alliances shattered, and at the heart of it all was a single truth. The trust between master and apprentice had been the glue holding this fragile system together. Once broken, it revealed just how much medieval power relied on the loyalty of those who worked in shadow. Florian's choice to expose his master didn't just end a partnership, it rewrote the map of Europe. Because in the end, the most dangerous alchemy wasn't turning lead into gold. It was turning secrets into weapons. The Church's relationship with alchemy was a masterpiece of contradiction. Public sermons condemned it as the devil's work, while shadowed cloisters buzzed with whispered requests for alchemical secrets. On the surface, bishops and abbots denounced the craft as heresy, warning flocks that tampering with nature's laws risked eternal damnation. But behind cathedral walls, the same hands that penned condemnations were often drafting lists of alchemists to recruit or manipulate. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was strategy, because in the high-stakes game of medieval influence, broken oaths between apprentices and masters became the Church's most potent leverage. Take the case of Brother Anselm, a Benedictine monk tasked with rooting out heresy in 14th century Avignon. Officially, his duty was to expose alchemists to the Inquisition. Unofficially, he kept a ledger of which apprentices might be persuaded to share their master's secrets, not for punishment, but for the Pope's private archives. When a Florentine alchemist's apprentice was caught forging documents, Anselm didn't deliver him to the flames. He offered absolution in exchange for every formula the young man had stolen. The result, a trove of knowledge the church later used to undermine rival city-states by flooding their markets with counterfeit gold. This duality reached its peak during the Council of Constance in 1415, where clergy debated alchemy's sins by day while by night, agents scoured the taverns for disgruntled apprentices. One such recruit, a German alchemist's aide named Klaus, was promised sanctuary from his debts if he revealed his master's work on metallurgy. That intelligence didn't just serve the church, it armed them. Within months, the Pope's allies were producing superior artillery, tipping the balance in regional conflicts. The lesson was clear: public condemnation of alchemy wasn't about morality. It was about control. By branding the craft dangerous, the church ensured its secrets remained scarce and therefore valuable. Yet the greatest irony lay in how these manipulations backfired. When a Spanish cardinal pressured an apprentice into betraying his Jewish master, the stolen formulas didn't just enrich the church. They leaked to Moorish scholars, who refined them into breakthroughs that eventually outpaced Christendom's own. And when a French bishop blackmailed an alchemist's apprentice into spying on a rival noble, the resulting scandal so damaged the church's credibility that local parishes revolted against tithes. Every betrayal the church engineered carried the same risk. Secrets, once freed, couldn't be contained. What's most revealing isn't that the church exploited these broken oaths, it's how often they miscalculated the consequences. By treating alchemical knowledge as a weapon to be wielded, they failed to see it as a force that could recoil. The very apprentices they coerced sometimes became double agents, feeding false formulas to discredit ecclesiastical patrons. Others, like Klaus, vanished after delivering their secrets, leaving the church holding fragmented knowledge they couldn't fully replicate. And in the end, this dance of condemnation and exploitation exposed a truth the church never admitted. Their power, like the alchemists, depended on a fragile web of trust. Once broken, it didn't just harm the masters left behind. It destabilized the very institutions that had orchestrated the betrayal. In the spring of 1485, a fortress stood between the armies of Castile and Granada, a castle so well supplied it could have held out for years. But wars aren't always won by numbers or brute force. Sometimes victory comes down to a single scrap of parchment, passed in secret. That's what happened when a Spanish apprentice named Diego, trained in the alchemical arts of refining saltpeter, smuggled a gunpowder formula to the besieging Moors. The recipe wasn't just any mixture, it was a closely guarded secret that made powder burn hotter, faster, and with terrifying precision. Overnight, the balance of power shifted. Walls that had shrugged off previous attacks crumbled under concentrated barrages, and within weeks, the castle's gates lay shattered. The fall of this stronghold didn't just mark a military defeat, it rewrote the map of the region, handing Granada a victory that prolonged their resistance for another critical year. What makes Diego's betrayal so chilling isn't just the tactical advantage it granted. It's how it exposed the invisible threads connecting alchemy to warfare. Gunpowder wasn't merely a tool, it was alchemy's deadliest application. Masters who'd spent lifetimes perfecting their recipes knew this truth intimately. The right ratio of sulfur to saltpeter could mean the difference between a fizzling dud and a wall-shattering explosion. And apprentices like Diego, they weren't just assistants, they were keepers of state secrets in the making. That's why the fallout from his betrayal rippled far beyond the battlefield. The Spanish crown, realizing how vulnerable their defenses now were, launched a frantic hunt for the traitor. But Diego had vanished, likely sheltered by the very forces he'd empowered. In his wake, paranoia spread like wildfire. Alchemists working on military projects found themselves under armed guard, their apprentices subjected to loyalty oaths so severe they bordered on sacraments. Yet the deeper lesson here wasn't about security, it was about the nature of knowledge itself. alchemy had always thrived on exchange, on masters passing down hard-won insights to their students. But what happened when those insights could topple kingdoms? The stolen siege formula forced rulers to confront an uncomfortable reality. The same networks that spread innovation could also spread destruction. After Diego's betrayal, the Spanish crown considered banning alchemists from gunpowder work altogether until they realized they couldn't afford to. The arms race of the late medieval period demanded constant refinement, and without alchemists, their enemies would gain the upper hand. So instead of abandoning the craft, they tightened their grip, turning workshops into vaults and apprentices into suspects. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of this betrayal was how it blurred the lines between scholar and soldier. Diego wasn't a warrior, he was a young man who'd spent his years grinding minerals and memorizing ratios. Yet his actions proved that in an age where science could dictate the outcome of wars, alchemists were as pivotal as generals. The castle's fall wasn't just a military loss, it was a turning point in how power was understood. From that moment on, no ruler could ignore the fact that the quietest hands in the workshop might hold the loudest weapons in the world. History remembers the alchemist's workshop as a world of men, hooded masters and their eager young apprentices, huddled over flasks in candlelit chambers. But scratch beneath the surface and you'll find a different story. Women weren't just bystanders in this clandestine trade. They were its hidden architects wielding influence from the shadows. Take the case of Giovanna of Florence, a name you won't find in most chronicles. Officially, she was listed as a scribe in her uncle's workshop, her delicate script filling the margins of his notebooks. Unofficially, she was the mind behind a poison so subtle it left no trace a formula she leaked to a rival faction in exchange for her family's safety. The result, an entire political bloc collapsed within weeks, their leaders succumbing to a mysterious illness no physician could diagnose. What's revealing isn't just Giovanna's act, it's how easily her role was erased. Male apprentices who betrayed their masters faced public trials, their names etched into court records as cautionary tales. Women like Giovanna, their stories were buried under layers of ink, dismissed as mere assistants or, worse, forgotten entirely. Yet their impact was undeniable. In Venice, a guild master's daughter named Isabetta secretly corrected her father's flawed mercury calculations, preventing an explosion that would have leveled their workshop. When she later defected to a rival alchemist, taking her refined methods with her, the incident was blamed on her father's carelessness. No one questioned how his errors had suddenly vanished under her watch. The irony was brutal. Women's exclusion from formal apprenticeships, often barred by guild statutes, forced them to master alchemy through back channels, deciphering notes left unattended, replicating experiments in secret, or learning through observation rather than instruction. This very marginalization became their advantage. Unbound by oaths they were never allowed to swear, they navigated the alchemical underworld with a freedom their male counterparts lacked. A French noblewoman's maid, Marguerite, used her access to private chambers to steal a dye formula that bankrupted her lady's rival textile merchant. In Spain, a nun named Sor Lucia smuggled out herbal antidotes from a convent's hidden stillroom, tipping the balance in a local feud. But here's the twist. While men's betrayals were framed as breaches of honor, women's acts were often recast as witchcraft or hysteria. A male apprentice selling secrets was a traitor. A woman doing the same was a seductress or a heretic. This double standard didn't just obscure their contributions, it amplified their risks. When Giovanna's poison was finally traced back to her, she wasn't tried for treason. She was burned for consorting with dark forces, her scientific knowledge rewritten as supernatural evil. Yet for all the attempts to silence them, these women left fingerprints on history. The poison that felled a Medici rival, Its recipe resurfaced decades later in a Milanese physician's notes, credited to an anonymous wise woman. The Venetian dye that revolutionized textile trade. Guild records show it was perfected in a workshop run by Isabetta's new patron, though her name appears nowhere in the ledgers. Their legacies weren't just in the secrets they stole, but in the systems they exposed the hypocrisy of a world that relied on their skills while denying their agency. So the next time you hear of an alchemical betrayal that shifted the course of history, ask yourself, who's missing from the story? Because behind every master's downfall, there might just have been a woman unseen, unnamed, and utterly indispensable. The most dangerous alchemical secrets weren't the ones that failed. They were the ones that worked just well enough to deceive. In the winter of 1493, a Hungarian nobleman named Count Balint received a gift that promised to rewrite his family's fortunes. A shimmering crimson stone, its surface etched with celestial symbols, delivered by his court alchemist star apprentice, Laszlo. The Count had poured years of gold into funding his alchemist's search for the Philosopher's Stone, that legendary substance said to transmute base metals into wealth. And now here it was, or so he believed. What Laszlo didn't reveal was that the stone was nothing more than cleverly dyed quartz, its weight augmented with traces of lead to mimic the density of precious metals. The Count's first test seemed to confirm the miracle. When rubbed against a copper coin, the metal took on a faint golden sheen, but the truth was far darker. The transmutation was a simple chemical reaction, one that crumbled upon closer inspection, leaving behind worthless residue and a noble house on the brink of ruin. The genius of Laszlo's deception lay in its timing. He didn't just present the stone and vanish. He staged a meticulous performance, allowing the Count to discover its power gradually. A silver goblet left overnight near the stone developed golden streaks. A rusted iron dagger, when wrapped in cloth with the artifact, emerged with a suspiciously untarnished gleam. Each small success tightened the Count's belief until he liquidated estates, sold ancestral jewels, and even borrowed heavily from rival nobles to fund larger experiments. By the time a visiting Venetian alchemist exposed the fraud, the Count's coffers were empty, his creditors were circling, and Laszlo had disappeared into the anonymity of the Ottoman Empire with a fortune in stolen gold. What makes this betrayal so revealing isn't just the scale of the financial wreckage. It's how it exposed the blurred line between alchemy and outright fraud in medieval courts. Many legitimate alchemists spent lifetimes pursuing the Philosopher's Stone as a scientific ideal, testing theories of matter and transformation. But for every sincere scholar, there were a dozen charlatans like Laszlo, who understood that the real magic wasn't in transmuting metals, it was in manipulating human desperation. The Count's downfall wasn't an isolated tragedy. Across Europe, noble houses crumbled under similar schemes, their hunger for alchemical shortcuts leaving them vulnerable to elaborate ruses. The aftermath was even more telling. Instead of prosecuting the few captured fraudsters, many rulers quietly absorbed their techniques. Hungarian King Mathias Corvinus, facing his own financial strains, reportedly hired a known counterfeiter to produce alchemical gold for diplomatic gifts, knowing full well it would degrade within months. In doing so, he turned deception into statecraft. The lesson was clear. When the illusion of wealth could buy as much power as wealth itself, even the most dishonest alchemy had its uses. Yet the deepest damage wasn't financial. It was the erosion of trust that rippled through the scientific community. After scandals like Laszlo's, genuine alchemists found doors slammed in their faces. Patrons demanded impossible guarantees, proof of success before funding even began. The very pursuit of knowledge became suspect, slowing progress for generations. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest irony of all. The fake philosopher's stone didn't just bankrupt a noble house, it poisoned the well for every alchemist who came after, turning their life's work into a question mark in the eyes of history. There's a hidden economy that history books rarely mention, one where knowledge wasn't just power, it was currency. When an apprentice broke their oath and fled their master's workshop, they didn't disappear into obscurity. More often than not, they slipped into a shadowy underworld where alchemical secrets could be traded like contraband. Picture dimly lit taverns in port cities like Naples or Marseille, where a disgraced alchemist might barter a stolen formula for forged travel papers, or a rebel faction could exchange safe passage for instructions on refining gunpowder. These weren't random transactions. They were the lifeblood of an intricate black market that stretched across borders, linking outcasts who'd been cast aside by the very systems that once nurtured them. Take the case of a network operating in 1620s Prague, where former apprentices of Emperor Rudolph's exiled alchemists formed a covert guild of their own. Calling themselves the Ashen Brotherhood, they specialized in selling purloined recipes to the highest bidder, whether that was a Scandinavian king desperate for new mining techniques or a Venetian merchant consortium seeking an edge in dye production. What made them so dangerous wasn't just their inventory of secrets, it was their ability to connect buyers and sellers who otherwise would never dare to meet. A French Huguenot rebel might receive smuggled instructions for crafting smoke bombs from a German defector, while a disgraced Spanish alchemist could trade his knowledge of mercury amalgamation for sanctuary in Ottoman land. The Brotherhood didn't care about politics or religion, only the value of the secrets exchanged. But here's what made these networks truly explosive. They didn't just traffic in knowledge. They redistributed power. A minor nobleman with enough gold could suddenly acquire the same alchemical leverage as a monarch, leveling the playing field in ways that terrified established rulers. When an English earl used the black market to obtain a stolen recipe for waterproofing ship hulls, he didn't just gain a naval advantage, he undermined the crown's monopoly on maritime technology. That's why punishments for those caught in this trade were so brutal. In 1584, a Milanese apprentice named Carlo was publicly disemboweled after being caught selling glass-making secrets to the French. His execution wasn't just about justice, it was a warning. The establishment needed apprentices to fear betrayal more than they craved the rewards of the underground. Yet for all the risks, the black market thrived because it offered something rigid guilds and royal courts couldn't: mobility. A talented apprentice trapped under a cruel master might spend decades in drudgery, but one daring escape could catapult them into a world where their skills commanded respect and wealth. Consider Marguerite of Lyon, a midwife's daughter who'd been forced into an alchemist's service as a cleaner. Over years of stealthy observation, she memorized his techniques for distilling medicinal oils. When she fled, she didn't just vanish, she became a legend in underground circles, teaching her stolen methods to apothecaries across Provence in exchange for a cut of their profits. By the time authorities pieced together her trail, she'd already funneled enough gold to open her own shop under a new identity. What's often overlooked is how these networks didn't just spread secrets, they improved them. Stolen knowledge rarely stayed static. A formula for counterfeit coinage might be refined by a Flemish metalsmith, tweaked by a Hungarian forger, and finally perfected by a Greek exile before resurfacing in a form even the original master wouldn't recognize. This constant evolution made the black market paradoxically innovative. While royal alchemists hoarded their discoveries for fear of leaks, the underground thrived on collaboration, albeit the kind that happened in whispers and coded letters. The legacy of these shadow exchanges lingers in unexpected ways. Modern intellectual property theft, It has roots in those medieval backroom deals, the dark web's anonymous marketplaces. They're just the digital descendants of taverns where a folded parchment could buy a new life. Because the truth is, once knowledge escapes its chains, it's nearly impossible to recapture. And that's the lesson these forgotten networks taught us. No oath, no matter how fiercely sworn, can truly contain an idea whose time has come. In the heart of Constantinople, where the aura of divine right clung to emperors like gilded armor, there was one thing more dangerous than a rebellion, a failed miracle. And that's exactly what happened in the autumn of 1341, when Emperor John V's ceremonial divine elixir turned to sludge in front of his entire court. The ritual was supposed to be the climax of his reign, a shimmering potion, crafted by his most trusted alchemist, that would prove heaven itself favored his rule. But as the golden liquid curdled in its chalice, so too did the empire's faith in his legitimacy. What no one knew was that the failure wasn't an accident. It was sabotage by an apprentice named Leo, who'd swapped a single critical ingredient in revenge for his master's execution months earlier. This wasn't just alchemical betrayal. It was political dynamite. Byzantine emperors didn't just rule, they performed their power through sacred rituals, blending religion and science into theater that convinced subjects they were chosen by God. The elixir's public failure didn't just embarrass John, it shattered the illusion of divine favor, giving his rivals the opening they needed. Within weeks, whispers spread through the city. If God had abandoned the emperor, why should the people obey him? The revolt that followed wasn't led by soldiers, it was fueled by silk merchants and priests who'd witnessed the ritual's humiliation firsthand. By winter, John was dragged from the palace in chains, his dynasty toppled not by swords, but by a single altered formula. What makes Leo's act so chilling is how precisely he understood the alchemy of power. He didn't just ruin a potion, he targeted the very spectacle that propped up imperial authority. Byzantine rulers had used sacred science for centuries, perfumes that never faded to symbolize eternal rule, alloys that resisted tarnish as metaphors for incorruptibility. These weren't just tricks, they were the visual language of legitimacy, a way to make abstract power feel tangible. When Leo sabotaged the elixir, he didn't just expose one man's weakness, he revealed the fragile machinery behind the throne itself. And that's why the fallout was so devastating. After John's overthrow, subsequent emperors grew paranoid about alchemical rituals. Some banned them entirely, fearing they'd become liabilities. Others hired multiple alchemists to duplicate each other's work, creating a labyrinth of checks and balances that slowed innovation to a crawl, the unintended consequence. Byzantium fell behind in the very sciences that had once been its pride. While Ottoman alchemists refined gunpowder and metallurgy, Byzantine workshops remained frozen in suspicion, their masters too fearful of betrayal to push boundaries. Leo's fate is lost to history, whether he fled to Italy or died in the riots, no chronicle says, but his legacy endured in the most unexpected way. A century later, when Mehmed II besieged Constantinople, his cannons battered walls that might have been reinforced with stronger alloys, if only the empire hadn't abandoned the alchemical progress that once made it great. The apprentices' revenge, it turned out, wasn't just the fall of one emperor. It was the slow unraveling of an empire's confidence in the very magic that built it. The punishment for a broken alchemical oath wasn't just about justice, it was theater, a message carved into flesh for all future apprentices to remember. Take the case of Henricus of Mainz, an alchemist's apprentice in 1426, who sold his master's formula for waterproof parchment to a rival monastery. When caught, his sentence wasn't mere execution. He was sealed inside a lead-lined barrel studded with iron spikes and rolled down the steps of the city's cathedral, a grotesque echo of the alchemical vessels he'd once tended. The chronicles describe how the barrel burst open at the bottom, revealing a body more mosaic than man, gruesome, absolutely, but the spectacle wasn't just cruelty. It transformed betrayal into a public lesson, a visceral reminder that the secrets of alchemy carried divine consequences. Yet for all their brutality, these punishments reveal a paradox. The more elaborate the retribution, the clearer it became that fear alone couldn't stop betrayals. In Venice, apprentices caught selling glass-making secrets were forced to drink molten glass, a poetic, if horrifying, mirror of their crimes. But records show at least 3 instances where the condemned had already smuggled out their knowledge before capture, rendering their deaths meaningless. This was the fatal flaw in the system. By the time an oath-breaker faced punishment, the damage was often irreversible. The knowledge had already escaped like smoke through a cracked alembic. Some punishments leaned into symbolism so heavy it bordered on dark comedy. In 1508, a French apprentice named Claude was convicted of stealing his master's gold-purifying technique. His sentence, to be suspended in a gilded cage over the workshop he'd betrayed, slowly starving as his former colleagues worked below. The cage itself was painted with counterfeit gold leaf, a mocking reminder of the false riches he'd pursued. But here's what the judges didn't anticipate. Claude's slow death became a magnet for dissent. Locals began leaving offerings of bread at night, and by the time he finally perished, he'd become a folk hero. The lesson backfired spectacularly, proving that even the most calculated cruelty couldn't control the spread of ideas. Then there were the punishments that blurred into legend. Folk tales sprouted like weeds around disloyal apprentices, stories of men cursed to weep mercury instead of tears, or whose hands turned to sulfur at the moment of betrayal. In Prague, rumors swirled about an apprentice named Jan who'd stolen a recipe for eternal youth, only to find himself aging a decade every time he spoke the stolen words. These weren't just fables, they were psychological warfare. By weaving betrayal into folklore, authorities turned morality tales into weapons. A peasant might not understand the chemistry behind alchemy, but they'd shudder at the tale of the apprentice whose tongue turned to lead after breaking his oath. But perhaps the most revealing punishments were the ones that never happened. For every apprentice dragged to the executioner's block, there were a dozen who vanished protected by new patrons who valued their stolen knowledge more than outdated notions of loyalty. When the Spanish crown discovered one of their royal alchemist's aides had defected to the Ottomans with artillery formulas, they didn't pursue him. Why? Because the Sultan had already paid the man's weight in silver, and Spain knew retaliation would spark a diplomatic firestorm. Sometimes the true punishment wasn't death, it was realizing betrayal could be profitable enough to rewrite the rules. In the end, these brutal consequences tell us less about medieval justice and more about the sheer power alchemical knowledge held. The harsher the punishment, the clearer it became. These weren't just crimes against individuals. They were tremors in the foundations of power itself, and no amount of lead-lined barrels or gilded cages could change the truth that once an idea escaped, even the most creative cruelty couldn't force it back into its flask. Love letters are supposed to be private unless they're written by an alchemist's apprentice with a grudge. In 1537, a bundle of stolen correspondence landed on the desk of Duke Wilhelm of Bavaria, and nothing in his court would ever be the same. The letters weren't just romantic musings, they were proof that his heir, Prince Albrecht, had been funding illegal alchemical experiments under the guise of wooing a noblewoman. The scandal didn't just humiliate the prince, it exposed a web of deception that reached into the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. and at the center of it all stood a nameless apprentice who'd risked everything, not for gold, but for a far more dangerous motive: heartbreak. The story begins with a young woman named Gisela, a minor noble's daughter who'd caught the prince's eye. What she didn't know was that his flattery hid a darker agenda. Albrecht had been funneling her family's money into a secret alchemy workshop, using their courtship as cover to explain his frequent absences. The apprentice working there, a quiet, sharp-eyed young man, had fallen in love with Gisela himself. When he discovered the prince's true intentions, he didn't confront him. He waited. For months, he meticulously copied every incriminating letter, every coded reference to forbidden transmutations, every receipt for smuggled mercury. Then, on the eve of Gisela's forced engagement to the prince, he slipped the entire dossier to her father. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Gisela's family broke off the match, but they didn't stop there. They leaked the letters to the Duke, who realized his son had been dabbling in the very practices the church had banned, practices that could get their entire dynasty excommunicated. Worse, the prince's experiments had been funded with taxes meant for imperial troops, a fact the Duke's political rivals were all too eager to exploit. Within weeks, the scandal reached Emperor Charles V, who saw an opportunity to weaken the Bavarian line. The prince was disinherited. The Duke's influence crumbled. And the apprentice, he vanished, though rumors say Gisela left a single white rose on the workshop steps the night she fled to a convent. What makes this betrayal so fascinating isn't just the political earthquake it caused. It's how it reveals the human stakes behind alchemy's secrecy. Most oath breakers acted for survival or ambition. This one acted because loyalty, when twisted into manipulation, can curdle into something far more volatile. The prince had assumed his apprentice's silence was guaranteed by tradition and fear. He never considered that love, spurned, furious love, could be the one force strong enough to shatter those bonds. The aftermath rippled far beyond Bavaria. Noble families across Europe began scrutinizing their heirs' alchemical pursuits, fearful of similar scandals. The church, already wary of secular rulers dabbling in forbidden arts, tightened its grip, and in workshops from Prague to Paris, masters started paying uncomfortable attention to their apprentices' personal lives, knowing now that a broken heart could be as dangerous as a stolen formula. Because the lesson here wasn't just about keeping secrets. It was about recognizing that even the most carefully guarded knowledge is only as secure as the people who hold it, and no oath can shield against the reckoning of a scorned soul. The most successful spies of the medieval world didn't lurk in shadows or carry daggers. They wore the stained aprons of alchemists' apprentices. Consider the case of a young man named Reinhold, who arrived at a Bohemian alchemist's workshop in 1482 with impeccable references and a talent for refining quicksilver. What his master didn't know was that Reinhold had been groomed since childhood by a rival duke's intelligence network, trained to recognize which herb combinations could paralyze a man or which metal alloys might strengthen armor. For 3 years, he played the model apprentice, grinding minerals, copying manuscripts, never once betraying his true mission. Then, on the eve of his master's greatest breakthrough, Reinhold vanished along with a formula for strengthening castle gates against cannon fire. Within months, 3 previously impregnable fortresses fell to his true patron's armies, their reinforced gates suddenly vulnerable. This wasn't an isolated incident. The archives of Venice's Council of 10 reveal at least 17 known cases of sleeper apprentices planted in rival city-states between 1400 and 1550. These weren't simple thieves, they were long-term investments, sometimes spending decades gaining trust before extracting the precise secrets their handlers needed. A French operative might spend years learning glass-making techniques only to sabotage a workshop's furnaces at a critical moment, creating shortages that crippled a rival's trade. Others, like Reinhold, focused on military applications, stealing metallurgical secrets that gave their sponsors an edge in warfare. What made these double agents so effective was how perfectly alchemy masked their true purpose. The constant movement of apprentices between workshops provided cover for infiltration. Coded messages could be hidden in recipe books, with ingredients lists doubling as troop movement reports. Even the alchemist's notorious secrecy worked in the spy's favor. A master who never shared his full knowledge couldn't spot the gaps in his apprentices' understanding. The Venetian spy Marco Dandolo reportedly spent 8 years studying under a German master without ever learning legitimate alchemy, because his sole focus was memorizing the man's contacts in the Hungarian court. Yet the most devastating betrayals often came from unwitting pawns. Many apprentices recruited as spies didn't realize they were being manipulated until it was too late. A young woman named Eliska thought she'd been hired by a Prague alchemist for her skill with distillation. Only later did she discover her master was actually a Habsburg agent who tailored her training to reverse engineer Polish gunpowder formulas. By the time she understood her role, the stolen knowledge had already been used to bombard her homeland's borders. These reluctant spies became the most dangerous of all. Their genuine passion for the craft made their deception undetectable until the damage was done. The legacy of these double agents reshaped more than just warfare. Their existence poisoned the well of trust that alchemy relied upon. Masters began demanding apprentices swear oaths not just to secrecy, but to specific noble patrons, a practice that inadvertently created paper trails of allegiance. Workshops transformed into fortified compounds, with masters like England's John Dee going so far as to develop elaborate counter-espionage ciphers to detect tampered notes. But perhaps the most ironic outcome was how these spies accelerated alchemy's decline. As rulers grew paranoid about leaks, they diverted funding to more secure sciences like mathematics, where knowledge could be verified without relying on fallible human bonds. In the end, the greatest alchemical secret these double agents revealed wasn't about metals or elixirs, it was about power itself. They proved that in a world where knowledge could topple kingdoms, the most valuable weapon wasn't a sword or a spell. It was patience, a convincing smile, and the willingness to grind herbs for years until the moment came to steal the future from under your master's nose. Fire has always been alchemy's oldest enemy, unpredictable, hungry, capable of reducing years of work to ash in minutes. But in the winter of 1498, flames didn't just consume parchment and herbs in a London workshop. They obliterated an entire lineage of knowledge, and the timing was too perfect to be chance. The fire began in the dead of night, racing through the shelves of the famed Mercer Library, a private collection housing treatises on metallurgy, medicine, and most crucially, the only surviving copies of a rival alchemical school's distillation techniques. By dawn, nothing remained but smoldering wreckage and a single, dazed apprentice named Thomas, who swore he'd only been tending the furnace as usual. The official verdict, a tragic accident; the truth, a calculated act of sabotage disguised as carelessness. What makes this betrayal so chilling isn't just the destruction, it's the precision of the loss. The Mercer Library wasn't some random target. Its manuscripts contained generations of alchemical breakthroughs from the Oxford Circle, a group of scholars whose methods had recently eclipsed those of Thomas's own master. With their work suddenly reduced to smoke, the balance of prestige swung violently back to Thomas's faction. No one could prove intent, of course, but seasoned alchemists noted the eerie coincidence. The furnace Thomas claimed to have been tending hadn't been used in weeks, and the fire had spread with unnatural speed, as if aided by a sprinkling of saltpeter. The aftermath revealed just how fragile alchemical knowledge truly was. Without written records, the Oxford Circle's techniques faded into half-remembered rumors. A method for purifying antimony, once considered revolutionary, became the stuff of tavern whispers. A painstakingly developed cure for gout vanished entirely, leaving physicians to rediscover it decades later. And Thomas, he vanished into the countryside, only to resurface years later as the head of his own workshop, one that just happened to specialize in the very techniques his rivals had lost. But the real casualty was trust itself. After the fire, masters across England began hoarding their knowledge in ways that stifled progress. Manuscripts were split into fragments, with each apprentice learning only disjointed pieces. Furnaces were guarded like treasure vaults, and apprentices found themselves barred from working alone. The unintended consequence: a generation of alchemists trained in isolation, their education full of gaps that no single master could fill. Innovation slowed to a crawl, and England, once a beacon of alchemical advancement, fell behind continental rivals. Yet the most haunting detail lies in the fire's legacy. Centuries later, chemists still debate whether key medieval discoveries were truly lost or merely hidden. When a 1920s archaeologist unearthed a cache of charred vials near the Mercer site, their contents matched descriptions of the Oxford Circle's famed Starlight elixir. Had Thomas stolen more than he destroyed, we'll never know, but the lesson remains: in the alchemist's world, sometimes the brightest flames aren't those that illuminate, they're the ones that erase. Guild records from 15th century Strasbourg tell of an apprentice who woke screaming night after night, convinced his hands were dissolving into the very mercury he'd stolen. In Milan, a young woman vanished from her workshop days after leaking a dye formula, leaving behind only a journal entry: "The oath follows me into my dreams." These weren't just footnotes in history, they were the human tremors beneath the grand narratives of betrayal. For every apprentice who profited from a broken vow, there were those who carried the weight long after the gold was spent or the secrets traded. The psychological toll of these betrayals often went unrecorded, but the fragments we have paint a haunting picture. Some apprentices developed compulsive rituals, washing their hands raw to scrub away invisible stains, or obsessively reciting their original oaths decades later. Others fled not just their workshops but their identities. A Parisian guild ledger notes one man who reinvented himself as a baker in a distant town, only to be recognized years later when he panicked at the sight of a copper cauldron, its sheen too close to the vessels he'd abandoned. These weren't just criminals evading punishment. They were souls grappling with a deeper rupture, the severing of a bond that had once defined their place in the world. What's often overlooked is how these personal unravelings reshaped alchemy itself. Masters began noticing patterns. Apprentices who betrayed their oaths rarely produced innovative work afterward, as if the act had hollowed out their creative spirit. A Venetian glassmaker's diary laments losing his most brilliant student to theft, only to find him years later in a rival's workshop, mechanically replicating old designs without a trace of his former spark. The craft relied on intuition as much as skill. An alchemist who'd shattered their own trust seemed to lose access to that elusive magic. Yet the guilt wasn't always private. Some betrayals became public spectacles of remorse. In 1491, a German apprentice named Stefan returned to his master's burned-out workshop after 5 years, publicly confessing his role in selling its secrets. But instead of sentencing him, the town council ordered him to rebuild the workshop brick by brick, a penance that took 7 years and left his hands permanently twisted from frostbite. The true punishment, the council declared, wasn't in his suffering, but in forcing him to recreate what he destroyed. Stephen's later work was said to be technically flawless but eerily lifeless, as if his atonement had cost him the very passion that made the betrayal tempting. Perhaps the most tragic cases were those who turned their guilt outward. The infamous poisoned scribe of Augsburg, a former apprentice named Ursula, spent years anonymously sending corrected formulas to the masters she'd wronged, each note written in toxin-laced ink that blistered the reader's fingers. Her twisted attempt at restitution revealed a painful truth. Some oaths once broken couldn't be mended with mere repentance. The deeper the bond had been, the more its fracture warped the betrayer's soul. These stories remind us that history's most dramatic betrayals weren't just political maneuvers or economic gambits. They were human choices with human consequences, choices that echoed not just through dynasties and markets, but through the fragile hearts of those who made them. Because an oath wasn't just a promise, it was a mirror, and to shatter it was to lose sight of oneself. The most devastating weapon in the Crusades wasn't a sword or a siege engine. It was a single vial of spoiled holy oil. In 1291, King Louis IX of France prepared for what he believed would be his most sacred campaign, a crusade to reclaim Jerusalem, blessed by the Pope himself. At the heart of his preparations lay a sacred alchemical formula, a consecrated oil said to protect warriors from injury when anointed before battle. The recipe, guarded by the king's personal alchemist, Brother Renaud, was more than just military strategy. It was divine assurance, a tangible link between heaven and the crusade's success. But when Louis's forces reached the shores of Tunisia, the oil failed spectacularly. Knights who'd been anointed fell just as swiftly as those who hadn't. The army's faith shattered overnight. What no one knew was that the failure wasn't divine displeasure, it was sabotage. Renaud's own apprentice, a young man named Thibault, had diluted the oil's key ingredient after accepting a bribe from a Tunisian emissary. The betrayal cut deeper than mere military setback. Louis's entire campaign had been built on the promise of celestial favor. Nobles had mortgaged lands to join him, priests had preached of certain victory, and common soldiers had marched with the conviction that God marched beside them. When the oil proved powerless, that certainty crumbled. Rumors spread like wildfire. Had the king been misled? Had God abandoned them? The timing couldn't have been worse. Tunisian forces, forewarned of the oil's altered potency, had prepared specifically to exploit the Crusaders' psychological vulnerability. Within weeks, dysentery ravaged the disillusioned army, and Louis himself succumbed, his death attributed not just to illness, but to the collective loss of faith. Thibault's motives reveal the brutal pragmatism of the medieval world. The bribe wasn't just gold, it was a guarantee of safety for his family in Marseille, a port city with deep trade ties to North Africa. The Tunisians hadn't just bought a betrayal, they'd exploited the fragile web of secular loyalties that underpinned even the holiest wars. And they'd understood something Louis hadn't. In an age where faith and science blurred, discrediting one could collapse the other. The oil's failure didn't just weaken French morale, it turned their own theology against them. The aftermath rippled far beyond the battlefield. When remnants of the crusade returned to Europe, they brought tales not of Muslim arrows but of divine abandonment. Louis's sainthood, hastily promoted by the church to salvage the disaster's narrative, couldn't erase the whispers. If an alchemist's apprentice could undermine a king anointed by God, what did that say about the divine right of rulers? Subsequent crusades would face unprecedented skepticism, their funding harder to secure, their recruits fewer. The church, recognizing the danger, cracked down on alchemical sacraments, declaring any mixture claiming divine power to be heresy unless directly blessed by the Pope. Thibault's fate is unclear. Some chronicles say he died in a Marseille brothel, his throat slit by a stranger. Others claim he fled to Alexandria, where his knowledge of European alchemy earned him a position in the court of the Mamluk Sultan. But his true legacy wasn't personal. It was the revelation that even the holiest wars could be swayed not by angels or demons, but by the quiet hands of those who ground the herbs, measured the tinctures, and understood how easily faith could be bottled or broken. The cracks in alchemy's foundation didn't appear overnight. They spread slowly like tarnished silver as each broken oath deepened the shadows of suspicion. By the 16th century, the once thriving networks of masters and apprentices had hardened into fortresses of secrecy. Workshops that had buzzed with collaboration now operated like clandestine cells, where masters hoarded knowledge like dragons guarding gold, and apprentices were watched with the scrutiny of potential traitors. The art that had once flourished in the open courtyards of kings became a whispered science, its practitioners isolated by their own paranoia. Take the case of Heinrich Kunrath, a famed alchemist who worked in Prague under Emperor Rudolf II. His manuscripts reveal a man so wary of betrayal that he encrypted his recipes in layers of allegory and symbolism, ensuring only the most devoted or desperate could decipher them. Even his illustrations hid clues behind intricate geometric patterns, a visual labyrinth meant to baffle the unworthy. This wasn't eccentricity, it was survival. Kunrath had seen too many colleagues ruined by apprentices who'd sold their secrets to the highest bidder. His precautions, while extreme, were emblematic of a broader shift. Alchemy was no longer a shared pursuit, but a solitary gamble. The consequences of this isolation reached far beyond individual workshops. As masters grew reluctant to train apprentices fully, the transmission of knowledge fractured. A young alchemist might spend a decade grinding herbs and tending furnaces, only to realize they'd been taught mere fragments of their master's craft. The gaps in understanding led to disastrous experiments, tarnishing alchemy's reputation. When a French nobleman's laboratory exploded in 1589, killing 3 servants, the investigation revealed his alchemist had been working with a flawed formula, one his master had deliberately altered to prevent theft. The tragedy wasn't just an accident, it was a direct result of the culture of distrust. Courts, once the proud patrons of alchemy, began to withdraw their support. Why fund a science that produced more secrets than gold? Why rely on experts who might vanish overnight, taking their promises with them? By the early 17th century, rulers increasingly turned to emerging fields like astronomy and mathematics, where knowledge was documented, debated, and crucially verifiable. The Medici family, once alchemy's most lavish sponsors, redirected their funds to Galileo's telescopes. King James I of England, burned by one too many charlatans, issued decrees condemning vain and deceitful alchemical practices. The message was clear: the age of alchemy as a courtly science was ending, not with a bang, but with a slow, suffocating silence. Yet the cruelest irony lay in how this decline fed upon itself. As opportunities dwindled, the few remaining alchemists grew even more possessive of their secrets, accelerating the cycle of suspicion. The art that had once promised to unlock the mysteries of the universe now languished in shadow, its practitioners too wary to share, too isolated to innovate. The oaths meant to protect alchemy had, in the end, strangled it, not because they were too weak, but because they had become all that remained. Some betrayals weren't just about gold or power, they were about justice served cold. In 1543, Poland's Duke Casimir, a ruler feared for his brutal taxes and iron grip, made a fatal mistake. He demanded his court alchemist produce a year's worth of gold in 3 months or face execution. The alchemist, an aging scholar named Marcin, knew the task was impossible, but his apprentice, a sharp-witted young man named Peter, saw an opportunity. For weeks they labored under the Duke's watchful eye, boiling mercury and grinding minerals, until at last they presented him with a gleaming ingot. Casimir, triumphant, paraded it before his court, even striking new coins bearing his likeness. Then, within weeks, the coins began to crumble. The gold was nothing but gilded lead, its surface luster fading to reveal the cheap metal beneath. The Duke's humiliation was absolute. His treasury mocked, his authority undermined by the very alchemy he'd weaponized. Peter's brilliance lay in the delay. He hadn't just created a counterfeit, he'd engineered a slow-motion disgrace. The formula included a trace of vinegar, which ate through the gold plating over time, ensuring the deception wouldn't be discovered until the coins were in circulation. By then, the damage was irreversible. Merchants refused the Duke's currency. Peasants, already burdened by his taxes, openly laughed at the crumbling coins. And when Casimir ordered Peter arrested, the workshop stood empty, its shelves stripped of every tool and manuscript, the only clue left behind, a single ledger page with a scribbled proverb, "The weight of tyranny cannot be gilded." This wasn't just sabotage, it was alchemy as political theater. Peter had turned the Duke's greed against him, exposing how fragile power becomes when it's built on fear and false promises. The scandal resonated far beyond Poland's borders. Other rulers, suddenly wary of their own alchemist's loyalty, began auditing workshops and demanding faster results, a cycle of suspicion that often backfired. In one notorious case, a Bohemian count imprisoned his entire alchemical staff after a failed test, only to realize too late that they'd been the only ones who understood how to stabilize his gunpowder supply. But Peter's revenge left a deeper legacy. His story became a folk legend among apprentices, whispered in workshops from Krakow to Paris. It proved that knowledge, even in the hands of the powerless, could be a weapon when wielded with patience and precision. And it revealed an uncomfortable truth. The same alchemy that propped up tyrants could just as easily unmask them, because in the end, no amount of gold, real or false, could buy back what Casimir lost that day, the illusion of control. Centuries may separate us from medieval workshops, but the dance of secrecy and betrayal plays out in eerily familiar ways today. Picture a Silicon Valley boardroom instead of a candlelit laboratory. Instead of stolen elixir formulas, we now have leaked algorithms and hacked prototypes. The tools have changed, but the underlying drama remains the same. Knowledge is power, and those who control it can make or break empires. Just as an apprentice's betrayal could topple a dynasty, a disgruntled employee with a USB drive can now destabilize a billion-dollar corporation. Take the case of a self-driving car engineer who smuggled thousands of files to a rival company in 2017. Like medieval alchemists fleeing with vials of mercury, he carried his secrets in innocuous containers, a backpack, a laptop, even a personal email account. The fallout, a legal battle so costly it nearly bankrupted his former employer. But here's where history's echo grows louder. The engineer wasn't just after money. Like many oath-breaking apprentices, he claimed he'd been wronged, passed over for promotion, his contributions ignored. The parallels are uncanny. Whether it's 15th century Burgundy or modern-day California, betrayal often wears the mask of justice. Corporate espionage today even mirrors the alchemical black market. Dark web forums trade proprietary chemical formulas just as medieval taverns trafficked in stolen dye recipes. In 2019, a Chinese pharmaceutical worker was arrested for smuggling cancer drug research, a theft that could have been lifted straight from the playbook of a Renaissance apprentice. selling his master's healing tinctures to the highest bidder. The incentives haven't changed: quick wealth, personal advancement, or sometimes just survival in cutthroat industries. Yet there's one crucial difference. Medieval masters could enforce oaths with branding irons or lead-lined barrels. Modern corporations rely on non-disclosure agreements and lawsuits paper shields against the same human impulses. Unlike their historical counterparts, these measures often fail. A 2022 study found that 80% of trade secret thefts involved insiders, today's apprentices, who'd signed ironclad contracts. Clearly, parchment or pixels, no document can fully bind ambition or resentment. The most haunting parallel lies in the collateral damage. When a medieval alchemist's secrets leaked, entire regions could lose their economic edge. Think of Venice's glassmaking monopoly crumbling after defection. Today, it's entire industries. The theft of OLED screen technology from a South Korean firm didn't just hurt one company. It shifted the global balance of power in electronics. Knowledge then and now isn't just property, it's the scaffolding of societies. Perhaps that's the enduring lesson. Whether it's a Duke's alchemist or a tech startup's lead developer, those who hold specialized knowledge will always be both assets and risks. The names change: Mercury becomes lithium, quill strokes become keystrokes, but the tension remains, because at its core, this isn't a story about alchemy or algorithms. It's about the oldest conflict of all, the struggle to control the invisible forces that shape our world. History loves a dramatic betrayal, but for every apprentice who broke their oath, there were dozens who kept their vows, often at staggering personal cost. Consider the story of Elena of Provence, a 15-year-old girl apprenticed to a renowned Catalan alchemist in 1429. When rival nobles stormed her master's workshop, demanding his famed fever remedies, they found Elena alone, guarding the locked recipe chest. The price for her silence: they broke her fingers one by one. Yet when the master returned, the chest remained sealed, its contents intact. Elena's defiance wasn't just loyalty, it was a quiet rebellion against the expectation that knowledge could always be stolen. These unbroken oaths often hid extraordinary sacrifices. In Nuremberg, an apprentice named Lucas endured 7 years of imprisonment after refusing to replicate his executed master's counterfeit coin formula for the city council. His resistance wasn't futile, it became legend among guilds, proof that some bonds transcended torture. Meanwhile, in Bologna, a young woman named Antonia smuggled her blind master's manuscripts to safety during the papal siege of 1512, disguising them as laundry while enemy soldiers ransacked the workshop. These weren't just acts of duty, they were conscious choices to value trust over survival. What's startling is how these loyalists shaped alchemy's evolution. Masters who knew their secrets were safe could take risks, like the Florentine alchemist Giovanni, who dared teach his apprentice Clara the full arc of his mercury experiments, leading to breakthroughs in purification that revolutionized medicine. Contrast this with the paranoid workshops where masters hoarded knowledge. Progress there stalled in endless cycles of suspicion and half-truths. The paradox is striking. The more apprentices proved trustworthy, the more masters could innovate, creating a virtuous cycle that advanced the craft. Yet the most poignant stories emerge from the shadows. A fragmentary letter found in a Spanish monastery tells of an unnamed apprentice who spent his final illness painstakingly recreating his master's lost notes from memory, knowing he'd never live to use them himself. In Ghent, a stained glass window depicts St. Michael holding scales, one side piled with gold, the other with a single parchment. Local law claims it honors a real apprentice who chose burning over betrayal. These fragments remind us that for all the chaos caused by broken oaths, the ones that held often birthed alchemy's most enduring legacies. the true measure of their impact lies in the manuscripts that survive. The Codex Florentinus, a masterpiece of medieval chemistry, contains a marginal note crediting its preservation to the steady hands of Marco, who copied this under siege. Dozens of such texts bear similar marks, quiet testaments to apprentices who became guardians. Their loyalty did more than protect recipes. It preserved entire lineages of thought that might have vanished in a more treacherous world. In the end, these unbroken oaths weren't just counterpoints to betrayal. They were the fragile threads that kept alchemy's brightest flames from flickering out entirely. The greatest tragedies in alchemy weren't the betrayals themselves, but the knowledge that vanished with them, leaving gaps in human understanding we'll never fill. Picture a 14th-century Venetian glassmaker's workshop, where an apprentice named Lorenzo fled with the formula for Cristallo, the clearest glass ever seen. The master, Enrico, had spent decades perfecting the recipe, balancing quartz purity with seaweed ash in precise ratios. When Lorenzo sold the secret to a rival city, Enrico took the remaining details to his grave in grief. Within a generation, the technique faded into myth, and Europe wouldn't see glass that transparent again for 300 years. This wasn't just a stolen trade secret, it was a rupture in the timeline of innovation. Some losses were deliberate acts of vengeance. In 1522, a German alchemist's dying apprentice burned his master's life's work. 800 pages of metallurgical breakthroughs after discovering the man had poisoned him to protect the secrets. The flames consumed a revolutionary method for strengthening iron without brittleness, a technique military historians believe could have changed the course of siege warfare. The charred scraps left behind taunted future generations with phrases like "quenching in stag's blood when the moon," before the parchment blackened into illegibility. These weren't just recipes lost, they were potential histories rewritten. Other disappearances were quieter but no less profound. The famed azure tincture, a blue dye so vibrant it made lapis lazuli look dull, vanished when its creator's apprentice drowned crossing the Alps with the only written copy. The master, half-blind with age, could never recreate the exact blend of woad and crushed sapphire. What makes this loss haunting isn't just the faded tapestries of the era, it's the realization that some colors literally existed in the past that we can't reproduce today. Modern spectrography of surviving fabric scraps confirms the dye used a chemical interaction we still don't fully understand. The cruelest irony, many lost formulas weren't even the initial targets of betrayal. A Spanish alchemist's cipher for turning mercury into a healing bomb disappeared because the apprentice who stole it couldn't decode the final step, a riddle based on his master's childhood memories. Without that key, the manuscript was useless, and the recipe joined the ranks of almost discoveries. These near misses haunt the history of science, reminding us how fragile knowledge truly is when it lives in solitary minds. Perhaps the most consequential loss was the Antidote Universal, a legendary remedy documented in Moorish Spain that could counteract everything from snake venom to plague. When Cordoba fell to Christian forces in 1236, a Jewish alchemist's apprentice smuggled the formula out only to be shipwrecked off Sicily. The surviving fragments spoke of a base of garlic aged in moonlight and a rare mountain lichen, but the proportions died with the traveler. Historians of medicine still debate whether this lost recipe might have shortened the Black Death's devastation 2 centuries later. These gaps in the record aren't just historical curiosities, they're roadmaps to alternate futures. Every time a master took a secret to the grave or an apprentice's theft broke the chain of transmission, humanity unknowingly forfeited potential paths of progress. The Renaissance might have arrived earlier if not for the lost steel hardening techniques. The age of exploration could have unfolded differently with unbreakable crystallo lenses for telescopes. And countless lives might have been saved if the antidote universal had reached the monasteries that became medieval hospitals. Yet there's a peculiar solace in these disappearances. They remind us that history isn't a straight line of accumulated knowledge, it's a labyrinth of might-have-beens, where even the brightest threads can snap without warning. And that's perhaps the final lesson of alchemy's lost formulas. In a world where knowledge is power, every betrayal doesn't just rewrite the past, it steals from futures we'll never see. From whispered oaths toppling kings to stolen formulas shifting wars, the betrayals of apprentice alchemists were more than personal dramas, they were historical turning points. Think of medieval power as a vast, intricate machine, its gears turning on alliances, wealth, and faith. Now imagine the smallest wrench an apprentice's hand, slipping a single stolen formula into a rival's grasp, throwing the entire mechanism into chaos. That's the real lesson here. The greatest upheavals often begin not on battlefields or in throne rooms, but in the quiet moments when trust fractures. Consider how differently history might have unfolded if just one of these betrayals had never happened. Without the sabotaged elixir that humiliated Emperor John V, Byzantium's decline might have slowed, buying crucial time against Ottoman conquest. Had the Venetian glassmaker's apprentice kept his oath, Europe's scientific instruments could have advanced decades sooner. These weren't just footnotes, they were pivot points where knowledge, like a virus, escaped its containment and mutated the course of events. Yet there's a deeper irony in these tales. The very systems designed to protect alchemical secrets, blood oaths, encrypted manuscripts, guild monopolies often hastened their own undoing. Treat knowledge as a prison and someone will always pick the lock. The apprentice who fled with a master's life's work wasn't just stealing, they were proving that no hierarchy, no matter how rigid, could fully control the human hunger to share, to profit, or sometimes simply to survive. This brings us to the uncomfortable question lingering beneath all these stories: who were the real villains? The apprentices who broke their vows, or the masters and patrons who hoarded knowledge like dragons guarding gold? When a single formula could lift a family from poverty or cure a village sickness, was betrayal always a sin, or sometimes the only justice in an unjust world? The answer, like alchemy itself, is rarely pure. What endures from this hidden history isn't just a cautionary tale about trust, it's a mirror. Today's corporate espionage, leaked patents, and intellectual property wars are just medieval workshops in modern clothing. The players have new names, the stakes different currencies, but the game remains unchanged. Knowledge will always slip its chains, and those who cling too tightly risk being left with nothing but broken locks. So the next time you hear a story about a stolen trade secret or a whistleblower's leak, remember, it's all happened before. The faces change, the tools evolve, but the dance of loyalty and betrayal is as old as the first master who ever feared their apprentice might outshine them. And that's the alchemist's true legacy, not the gold they failed to make, but the timeless truth they uncovered about power, secrecy, and the irresistible urge to set knowledge free. If these shadows of the past lit up something curious for you, don't forget to like and subscribe. More untold stories are waiting in the wings. And down in the comments, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What other hidden levers, then or now, do you think have quietly reshaped the world? After all, history's greatest secrets often start as whispers, just like an apprentice's promise, trembling on the edge of being kept or broken.